Corporate Compliance Manager for NIBCO Incorporated and the Chairman of the ASA Safety Committee in alliance with OSHA. Almost monthly, the committee publishes articles and toolbox talks on various safety subjects. These can be viewed and downloaded from the ASA site at www.asa.net. Also available on the ASA site are recordings and downloads of the previous webinars. All of these items are available free to the public. Look for the Safety Resources link on the ASA homepage, which is located at www.asa.net. If you have any problems, contact Ben Stevens at the ASA for assistance. This webinar is being recorded for later viewing. Everyone that registered for the webinar will receive an email notifying them when the replay is available and a link to its location. All attendees are in mute mode. To submit a question during the presentation, you can enter it in the chat window. Before you send it, be sure the settings are sent to organizers and panelists so that we can see the question. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation as time allows. Also, a document with all questions and their answers and other documents related to the webinar will be posted on the ASA site along with the replay of the webinar. Before I introduce our guest today, I'd like to draw your attention to the ASA supplier partners shown on the screen and thank them for their industry leadership. The webinar today is OSHA Hazard Communication Standards and the new GHS, Global Harmonization System. The presentation today is directed toward non-manufacturing facilities such as warehouses and distribution centers. Tomorrow we will have a follow-up presentation directed toward manufacturing. The presenter today is Louisa Mayers, Director of Regulatory Services Group for SDS Pro, formerly known as MSDS Pro. The Regulatory Services Group includes SDS authoring, and the corporation since 1995, SDS Pro has provided industry-leading MSDS and chemical inventory management solutions and software to ensure employee safety with hazardous chemicals. Full bios of the presenter will be posted with the webinar documents on the ASA site. And now I turn the presentation over to Louisa.
Thank you, Ricky, and good day, everyone. On behalf of SDS Pro, I'd like to thank the American Supply Association and the ASA Safety Committee for the opportunity to present this webinar, Ensuring Workplace Safety under OSHA Hazard Communication Standard 2012. With the May 2012 implementation of the revised HAZCOM standard, U.S.-based wholesalers, distributors, manufacturers, and general industry alike are chartered with the responsibility of updating their hazardous chemical training plans to meet the new chemical compliance obligations resulting from the final rule. Today's webinar agenda will address the following: OSHA's final rule, HAZCOM 2012, and, to an extent, GHS, the Global Harmonization Standard for the Classification and Labeling of Chemicals. We'll address the GHS label elements and changes to the safety data sheet, spending the majority of the webinar on the specified format and content of the manufacturer's MSDS, now known as SDS, and learn what data derives the workplace label under the HAZCOM standard. We'll also review the phase-in dates for compliance with HAZCOM 2012 and take a look at resources available to employers today to help them meet chemical compliance obligations under the final rule, including a checklist to start that process in the workplace. Let's get started. GHS stands for the Globally Harmonized System for the Classification and Labeling of Chemicals. GHS is an international approach to hazard communication, providing criteria for the classification of chemical hazards worldwide according to their health and physical hazards, and a standardized approach to label elements in safety data sheets. Initially addressed over 20 years ago, GHS was proposed by the United Nations to all countries to protect workers and the environment from chemical hazards at a global level. Starting in June 2007, New Zealand, Japan, and other Asia-Pacific countries were the first of several to adopt GHS because they had no real system for chemical hazards classification in place. Why did the United States adopt GHS? First, a little bit of history. Back in 1983, OSHA enacted the Hazard Communication Standard to ensure that the hazards of all chemicals produced or imported are evaluated, and that these chemical hazards are communicated in the workplace through a comprehensive hazard communication program, container labeling, safety data sheets, and employee training. OSHA's final rule to align with the United Nations GHS took effect back in May 2012. As a result, chemical manufacturers and importers must now classify their products under Revision 3 of the United Nations GHS. They must provide labels that include applicable signal words, GHS pictograms, and hazard and precautionary statements for each hazard class and category. The new SDS format now requires 16 specific sections, ensuring consistency in the presentation of important worker protection information. OSHA's revisions to the HAZCOM standard are expected to improve the use of work practices and appropriate exposure controls to lessen the health and safety risks associated with hazardous chemical exposure. This table summarizes OSHA's phase-in dates for compliance with the revised standard. The first deadline is December 1, 2013, less than 8 months away. This deadline is for U.S. employers who must train their employees on the GHS label elements and revised safety data sheet format. The following date, June 1, 2015, is the date where employers are to comply with all of the modified elements of the final rule. A special note, as of December 1, 2015, distributors may ship chemical containers only if the GH label is attached. And finally, on June 1, 2016, all alternative workplace labeling and HAZCOM programs must be updated by the employer. These updates should include any additional employee training for newly identified physical or health hazards. The link to this phase-in table may be found here. Under the revised HAZCOM standard, the format of the manufacturer's United States Safety Data Sheet requires 16 specific sections. The maximum deadline for complying with HAZCOM 2012 is June 2015, a little over 2 years away. These bullet points summarize the steps chemical manufacturers, blenders, and importers are currently taking to comply with HAZCOM 2012, specifically conducting a chemical inventory to identify their active products, classifying the individual substances and resulting mixtures under HAZCOM 2012, and providing the GHS classification to members of their supply chain, including R&D formulators, marketers, distributors, and end users. It's not an easy task. As for training considerations, under the revised HAZCOM standard, chemical manufacturers and importers must classify their finished products and label them accordingly. Employers are responsible for preparing a written hazard communication program to include a list of hazardous chemicals and ensure proper labeling of those hazardous chemicals and worker training. For employers, the updated HAZCOM standard has resulted in a renewed emphasis on focusing worker training on the right to understand. Employees should be trained when they're assigned to work with the chemical, over and above being handed a safety data sheet. And as you know, employees must be trained in a thorough manner on the chemical hazards in their work areas. Given that the December 1st phase-in date to train workers on the GHS label elements and SDS format is less than 8 months away, employers are encouraged to start this training as soon as possible, as products imported into the United States are often accompanied by safety data sheets with the GHS pictograms and health and physical hazard statements, and an increasing number of manufacturers shipping their chemical products within the United States have already updated their SDSs to include elements of the UN GHS. These U.S.-based manufacturers actually benefit twice, meeting internal HAZCOM 2012 compliance requirements as employers, and having the SDSs as one component, showcasing their competitive advantage in the marketplace. One of our webinar registration questions was, what concerns you most about HAZCOM 2012? An overwhelming majority cited the top 2 bullets as primary concerns with labeling, that being the accuracy of data and compliance with regulations. For those employers using an electronic MSDS management or other software application to generate secondary container labels for their chemical products, the process of creating labels is as simple as selecting the product, selecting the label type, for example, NFPA or HMIS label, and the label size, then saving the document to PDF or sending the file to the local printer to print the labels on weatherproof, water-resistant label stock. With label requirements under OSHA HAZCOM 2012, in addition to the product identifier and the name, address, and phone number of the responsible party, OSHA HAZCOM 2012 has introduced the following elements: a signal word indicating the severity of the hazard, applicable GHS pictograms which convey the health, physical, or environmental hazards of a product, hazard statements which describe the nature and degree of the hazard, and precautionary statements which describe how to minimize or prevent effects from hazardous chemical exposure or improper storage of the chemical. Out of the 9 GHS pictograms shown here, OSHA HAZCOM 2012 requires 8 of these pictograms. The exception is the environmental pictogram, as environmental hazards are not within OSHA's jurisdiction, but rather that of the EPA. The hazard class of a physical or health hazard may be subdivided in the criteria of several hazard categories based on the degree of severity of the hazard. Health hazards are determined by a complex calculation based on ingredient classification versus a cutoff percentage. Physical hazards are classified based on the physical data of the product mixture, for example, flash point. With GHS, the MSDS format now specifies a 16-section SDS heading, the order of information, and the information to be provided under those headings to comply with the updated HAZCOM standard. For the United States, while OSHA doesn't enforce sections 12 to 15 that require information outside OSHA's jurisdiction, the sections are required to appear on the SDS to be consistent with the United Nations Globally Hazardous System. Section 12, Ecological Information, is regulated by the EPA. Disposal considerations are regulated by the EPA and RCRA for waste. Section 14, Transport Information, is regulated by the U.S. Department of Transportation, and regulatory information in Section 15 is regulated by various agencies, including U.S. federal regulations, the Clean Air Act, State Right to Know, California Proposition 55, among many others. As we go through this next section of the presentation, please note that what is being shared today is intended as a general overview of the safety data sheet format under the revised HAZCOM standard and is not meant to be a formal training session. States with OSHA-approved state plans may have additional requirements for chemical safety data sheets. In Section 1, one way to identify the country regulation covered by the SDS is to look at the front page header of the document. This example shows that this document conforms to HAZCOM 2012 for the United States. Section 1 identifies the chemical and its identified use. It also provides supplier information under the revised standard, the product identifier used on the label, any other supplier contact information, common names or synonyms of the product, contact information of the manufacturer, importer, or other party responsible for the product, and an emergency phone number. Section 1 also describes what the chemical does and recommendations for use as given by the supplier. Section 2, as mentioned previously, the SCS format has gone through significant changes. Here in Section 2, all applicable hazard classes and categories and labelments of the final product, whether a product is a pure or a mixture, are shown here. The applicable category must always be shown next to the applicable hazard. The required information consists of the hazard classification of the chemical, flammable liquid, Category 2, as an example. The GHS label elements under HazCom 2012 state that the label and classification must match the product SDS. Hazard pictograms, which may be presented as a graphical reproduction of the symbol in black or white, or be a description of the name of the symbol, for example, skull and crossbones or plane, would be shown here, as well as signal words. Only 2 signal words are possible under HazCom 2012, danger or warning. The term caution may no longer be used. Hazard statements are found in Section 2, as are precautionary statements, including those for prevention, response, storage disposal, as well as hazards not otherwise classified. Section 3 of the OSHA HazCom 2012 Safety Data Sheet identifies the ingredients contained in the product. It includes information on substances, mixtures, and all chemicals where a trade secret may be claimed. For substances, the chemical name, common name, and other means of identification are stated here. Also stated is a CAS number and other unique identifiers. For mixtures, the same information is required here as are for substances. Concentrations of each hazardous ingredient in the mixture are stated given the following scenarios. A trade secret claim is made for the raw material ingredient. There is a batch-to-batch variation of the ingredient in the final formulation, or the SDS applies to a group of substantially similar mixtures not affecting the final hazard classification. In Section 4, first aid measures are described, reflecting the initial care to be given to an individual who has been exposed to a hazardous chemical. This required information includes the necessary first aid instructions by relevant routes of exposure, whether it be through eye contact, inhalation, skin contact, and ingestion. Section 4 also provides a description of the most important symptoms or effects, any symptoms that are acute or delayed, and overexposure signs or symptoms based on the route of entry. And finally, this section also lists recommendations for immediate medical care when necessary, through notes to the physician, specific treatments needed, and protection of those providing first aid. Section 5 in the OSHA HazCom 2012 SDS provides recommendations on how to fight a fire caused by the chemical, including recommendations of suitable and unsuitable extinguishing equipment. Section 5 also advises on specific hazards arising from the chemical during a fire, such as hazardous combustion products created when the chemical burns. Special protective actions and equipment for firefighters are also listed here. Section 6 provides recommendations on the appropriate responses to spills, leaks, or releases, including the containment and cleanup practices to prevent or minimize exposure to people, property, or to the environment. It may also include recommendations distinguishing between responses for large and small spills where the spill volume has a significant impact on the hazard. The required information may consist of recommendations for use of personal precautions and protective equipment to prevent the contamination of skins, eyes, and clothing. Methods and materials for containment and cleanup procedures are also stated here. Section 7 consists of precautions for safe handling, including handling incompatible materials. This section provides advice on general hygiene practices, such as the prohibition of eating, drinking, and smoking in work areas, the conditions for safe storage, including any incompatibilities, and advice on specific storage requirements. Section 8 lists the exposure limits, engineering controls, and personal protective measures that can be used to minimize worker exposure to the hazards. The required information consists of OSHA permissible exposure limits, known as PELs, the ACGIH threshold limit values, PLVs, and any other exposure limit used or recommended by the chemical manufacturer, importer, or employer as available, as well as appropriate engineering controls. Section 8 provides recommendations to prevent illness or injury from exposure to chemicals, such as PPE, for example, appropriate types of eye, face, skin, or respiratory protection needed based on the hazards and potential exposure. Any special requirements for PPE, including protective clothing or respirators, are stated here. For example, under skin protection, hand protection, chemical-resistant impervious gloves, body protection, including anti-static overalls, boots and gloves, other skin protection, and respiratory protection. In this case here, an air respirator. Section 9 addresses the physical and chemical properties of the product. The minimum required information consists of the following: the appearance of the product, including the physical state and color, the odor as applicable, the odor threshold, pH, melting point and freezing point, initial boiling point and boiling range, flash point, evaporation rate, and the flammability. This section also lists the upper and lower flammability or exposure limits, vapor pressure, vapor density, relative density, solubilities, and so on. Note that the SDS may not contain every item on the above list because information may not be relevant or is not available. Manufacturers may also add other relevant properties such as the dust deflagration index for combustible dust used to evaluate a dust explosive potential. Deflagration is defined as the chemical process where a substance rapidly and intensely burns. This process is generally faster than combustion, but slower than detonation. For Section 10, Stability and Reactivity, this section describes the reactivity hazards of the chemical and the chemical stability information, stated in 3 parts. The reactivity, describing the specific test data for the chemical, chemical stability, which indicates whether the chemical is stable or unstable under normal ambient temperature and the conditions while in storage and in being handled, and other, which indicates the possibility of hazardous reactions, whether the chemical will react or polymerize, which could release excess pressure or heat, or create other hazardous conditions. Also, a description of the conditions under which hazardous reactions may occur may be found in this section. Section 11, Toxicological Information, identifies toxicological and health effects information or indicates that such data are not available. As an example, LD50 values are stated here. Section 11 also indicates whether the chemical is listed in the most recent National Toxicological Program, NTP, report or carcinogens. The report on carcinogens is a congressionally mandated, science-based public health report that identifies agents, substances, mixtures, or exposures, collectively called substances, in our environment that may potentially put people in the United States at increased risk for cancer. Section 11 also indicates whether the chemical is listed or found to be a potential carcinogen by OSHA or has been found to be a potential carcinogen in the latest editions of the International Agency for Research on Cancer monographs, known as the IARC monographs. The monographs identify environmental factors that can increase the risk of human cancer. These include chemicals, complex mixtures, occupational exposures, physical agents, biological agents, and lifestyle factors. National health agencies can use this information as scientific support for their actions to prevent exposure to potential carcinogens. Section 11 identifies the likely routes of exposure. In this case, oral, dermal, and inhalation are listed as likely routes. It also lists potential acute health effects and symptoms related to the physical, chemical, and toxicological characteristics for eye contact, inhalation, skin contact, and ingestion, as shown in this slide. The manufacturer's SDS should indicate if the information is unknown. Description of the delayed, immediate, or chronic effects from short and long-term exposure should also appear here. And finally, Section 11 lists the potential chronic health effects and acute toxicity estimates if available. Section 12, Ecological Information, is regulated by the Environmental Protection Agency. It provides information to evaluate the environmental impact of the chemicals if they were released into the environment. This information may include data from toxicity tests performed on aquatic and or terrestrial organisms where available, whether there is a potential for the chemical to persist and degrade in the environment, and results of tests of bioaccumulation potential. The potential for a substance to move from the soil to the groundwater and other adverse effects, including ozone layer depletion potential, photochemical ozone creation potential, and global warming potential, among others, is also stated here, if known. Section 13 is also regulated by the EPA and RCRA for waste. Disposal considerations provides guidance on proper disposal practices, recycling or reclamation of the chemicals or its container, and safe handling practices. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, commonly referred to as RCRA, is our nation's primary law governing the disposal of solid and hazardous waste. Read in conjunction with Section 8, Exposure Controls and Personal Protection, to minimize exposure, the information found here in Section 3 may include detailed information on the appropriate disposal containers to be used, appropriate disposal methods to employ, and what physical and chemical properties that may affect disposal activities. Language discouraging sewage disposal and any special precautions for landfills or incineration activities are also stated here. Section 14 is regulated by the U.S. Department of Transportation. Transportation information in Section 14 lists the DOT regulations governing the shipment of chemical products by various means of public transportation. At minimum, this section includes the U.S. DOT shipping name, the exact name as listed in the hazardous materials table, the 49 CFR 172.101, including the DOT hazard class number and the UN number, which can be found in the emergency response guide. The packing group or level of packing required to mitigate the hazard during transport, any required DOT label, including corrosion, poison, poison gas, flammable liquid, flammable solid, dangerous when wet, and so on. Section 14 also conveys environmental hazards. For example, to identify if it's a marine pollutant according to the International Maritime Dangerous Goods Code, the IMDG code, as well as emergency response guide number, the number that identifies the set of precautions to be taken when a hazardous material spills occur on public roads, the IATA shipping name and required labels. Like the DOT, the shipping name and labels are specific for labeling hazardous materials for shipment outside of the U.S., and any restrictions of methods of transport, as many hazardous materials are forbidden to be transported by air. Section 14 also lists any special precautions which an employee should be aware of or needs to comply with in connection with transport or conveyance either within or outside their premises. Section 15 of the OSHA HAZCOM 2012 Safety Data Sheet lists regulatory information. It identifies the safety, health, and environmental regulations specific for the product not indicated anywhere else on the safety data sheet. This information may include any national and or regulatory information from a regional basis for the chemical or mixtures. In this example, the regulations include TSCA 8A and 8B, Clean Air Act Sections 112 and 602, the DEA Lists 1 and 2, and SARA 302, 304, 304 RQ, Reportable Quantities, Section 311 and 312. The SCSs must indicate whether the chemical product is listed or the regulation is applicable. In this example, the ingredient acetone is responsible for the SARA 311-312 fire and immediate acute health hazard, listed at the concentration percentage on the table shown here. State regulations where the material is listed are also shown in Section 15, as are international regulations, the International Lists, and Chemical Weapons Convention lists. The last part, Section 16, contains other information. Other useful information may be included here, including HMIS and NFPA data, should the manufacturer wish to include it on the SDS. If an employer has an in-plant or workplace system of labeling that meets the requirements of HAZCOM 1994, the employer may continue to use this system in the workplace as long as the system, in conjunction with other information immediately available to the employees, provides the workplace employees with all of the information on the health and physical hazards of the hazardous material. Employers may continue to use rating systems such as NFPA diamonds or the HMIS requirements for workplace labels as long as they are consistent with the requirements of the HCS and the employees through training, are fully aware of the hazards of chemicals used. Going back to the phase-in dates that OSHA has supplied, during this time, between now and June 2015, manufacturers are in the process of migrating their SDSs into the new standard. As a result, we'll see more often than not a combination of the HMIS labels, NFPA labels, as well as the GHS labels in the workplace. Section 16 also indicates when the SDS was prepared or when the last known revision was made. The SDS may also state where the changes have been made to the previous version. Employers may contact the supplier for an explanation of the changes, and other useful information may also be included here. Under OSHA HAZCOM 2012, the HMIS rating and the NFPA rating do not appear on the SDS by default. Per OSHA, employers may choose to label workplace containers either with the same label that would be on the ship containers for the chemical under the revised rule, or with label alternatives that meet the requirements for the standard. Alternative labeling systems such as the NFPA 704 hazard rating and the HMIS are permitted for workplace containers. However, the information supplied on these labels must be consistent with the revised HCS. In other words, no conflicting hazard warnings or pictograms. It's a given that manufacturers will be transitioning their finished product SDSs over the next few years. As such, OSHA continues to maintain the approach used in the current HCS, in that employers may continue to use these workplace-specific labeling systems as long as they provide the required information. This is especially important to note that workplace label systems will likely require an update to ensure that the workplace label information is consistent with the new classifications under HAZCOM 2012. The labels should state the same information as the updated SDS and or make reference to the safety data sheet. Getting back to the phase-in dates, it's important to point out again that the transition period allows for compliance with one or both systems, considering all HAZCOM documents in circulation for any given manufacturer. OSHA has made it very clear to employers that the labels on ship containers as well as workplace labels must be explained, as well as the format of the SDS. Again, refer to the timeline by clicking on the link above for that table. Turning our attention now to the resources that are available, OSHA.gov provides a great deal of detailed information on safety and health topics related to hazard communication. This information includes several OSHA guidance documents. OSHA has made these reference materials available to assist U.S. employers with updating their hazardous chemicals training programs to include the GHS label elements and format of the revised SDS. These guidance documents include OSHA briefs on the safety data sheet, as well as labels and pictograms. The guidance documents also include a fact sheet on the Hazard Communication Standard Final Rule, as well as quick cards on safety data sheets, labeling, and the GHS pictograms. Employers continue to be responsible for maintaining updated safety data sheets in the workplace and must provide training on the new GHS elements and SDS format by December 1, 2013. Their current hazard communication programs should be reviewed and updated as necessary. For manufacturers in particular, they will need to address the reclassification of their products and prepare updated SDSs and labels under the updated standard. With OSHA guidance documents in hand, including fact sheets, quick cards, and the HCS briefs on safety data sheets, labels, and pictograms, the following is a roadmap that you as an employer can use today to meet or beat these phase-in dates for complying the revised standard. This would apply whether you're a wholesaler, a distributor, manufacturer, or downstream customer in the supply chain. Consider this a checklist for compliance. Employers must ensure the most current supplier SDSs for each chemical product used in the workplace is available to their employees and chemical users. Do not presume that chemicals previously considered non-hazardous by the manufacturer remain so under OSHA HAZCOM 2012. The only way to know is to obtain the most current safety data sheet available directly from the manufacturer. The main steps in this process are to audit your hazardous chemicals, to conduct a chemical physical inventory of your facility in each location, including shipping and receiving areas, flammable cabinets, supply closets, the production floor, and maintenance areas. As you inventory your chemicals, ensure all containers are properly labeled. Identify those chemicals eligible for disposal, and locate unauthorized chemicals throughout your facility. The next step is to acquire updated safety data sheets for your chemicals. I've been using the terms SDS, or safety data sheet, throughout the presentation. As we know, the former term was material safety data sheet. What we'll find over the course of the next few years that these terms will be used interchangeably. Both terms reflect the safety data sheet with the information required for important protection for the workers. Again, the next step is to acquire these updated safety data sheets for these chemicals. Contact your manufacturers, your suppliers, and distributors in your supply chain for these updated regulated documents for all of the products stored in your facility. Next step, safety data sheet distribution. Distribute your supplier safety data sheets. Ensure your chemical users in the workplace have free, unlimited access to the updated documents via electronic means, hard copy SDSs, in binders, or a combination of SDS distribution methods. And finally, and most important, train your employees. Update your existing hazardous chemical training program to include the GHS data elements and format of the SDS. And with that, Ricky, I believe we're ready for some Q&A.
Yes. Our first question today: Our warehouse works with chemicals in sealed containers under normal conditions of use. What information do I need to provide to my workers even though we don't open or use these chemicals?
That's a great question, and it's especially geared to our distributors in the audience today. The first thing to note is that all employers, in addition to those in manufacturing and importing, are responsible for informing and training their workers about the hazards in the workplace. They're responsible for retaining the warning labels and making available the safety data sheets for those hazardous chemicals. Some companies deal with chemicals in sealed containers, like the person who asked the question. Examples include the retail trades, warehousing, and truck and marine cargo handling. Regardless of their business, these employers must assure that the labels are affixed to the incoming containers and that these labels are kept in place. They have to ensure that the labels that are affixed to these containers aren't removed. They must also maintain and provide access to the safety data sheets received for these products or obtain the SDSs if requested by one of their employees. And finally, they should train their workers on what to do in the event of a spill or a leak of a hazardous chemical from a sealed container. I hope that answers the question.
Well, and I presume you're saying from that that the employees still have to be trained on how to interpret the SDS even though the chemical is not in use, but in case there's a spill, they have to, in an emergency, be able to interpret the information that's there, correct?
Absolutely. That's correct.
Okay, question number 2. Who is responsible for providing SDSs to distributors and their employees?
Another really good question. And for that, we can certainly reference the standard itself. But to summarize a very lengthy standard, the chemical manufacturer or importer is initially responsible for providing the safety data sheet to the distributor or to the employer with the shipped containers. Alternatively, chemical manufacturers or importers can send out the safety data sheets to the distributor or employer prior to or even at the time of shipment. There may be cases where the safety data sheet doesn't accompany shipment. It's not provided with the shipment of the hazardous chemical. When that occurs, the distributor or the employer should obtain one as soon as possible from the manufacturer or the importer. That SDS must be provided to the distributor or employer upon request per the OSHA HCS standard. Now, with that in mind, in turn, the distributor should ensure that the safety data sheets and updated information on the safety data sheet are also provided to other distributors and employers with that initial shipment. What I mean by that is the chemical manufacturer or importer who has the responsibility of creating that initial safety data sheet also has that same level of responsibility to provide an updated safety data sheet when some significant information on the safety data sheet is changed, whether it be the final hazard classification or methods by which to protect workers if that has been changed or augmented. So to that extent, the manufacturer must also provide updated safety data sheets with the next shipment of that product. Distributors shall either provide the safety data sheet with the with the shipped containers, as I mentioned, or send them to the other distributor or employer prior to or at the time of shipment. Wholesale distributors shall also provide safety data sheets to employers or other distributors upon request. So as you can see, Ricky, there's a great deal of communication that needs to take place in the supply chain, from the R&D formulator to marketing within the manufacturer's organization, to the shipment of the product along with the safety data sheet, as well as the distribution of updated safety data sheets, whether as a result of converting them to meet the OSHA HCS 2012 standard, or when additional information is found that requires an update to the safety data sheet itself.
Okay, and how long should a company retain an SDS and its previous versions since it's been in use or possible use at a facility?
That's a great question. And in the years that I've been with the organization, it's a question that we receive quite often. Back in, I want to say, back in 2006, I recall a conversation that I had with an OSHA official who said, to be on the safe side, the information with regards to the chemical hazard, whether it appear on a safety data sheet or other documentation, should be retained for the life of the business plus 30 years. In other words, forever.
Yes.
What I would suggest is that for manufacturers, distributors, wholesalers, and any employer in the audience today who wants to get a more firm handle on what those requirements mean and the different ways they can store this information, whether they can archive electronically material safety data sheets or be able to provide some type of mechanism where they can refer back to a safety data sheet that was used maybe 2, 3, 5, 10 years ago, I would certainly encourage a dialogue between the employer and OSHA. But what we are aware of, and it hasn't changed in the years that I've been with the organization, is that to be on the safe side, keep it forever. The life of the business plus 30 years.
Okay.
Okay?
And our next question, what are the requirements to update the company MSDS or SDS? And it says, we're not a vendor, but a user of chemicals. Is there a deadline of when we have to update them?
Well, one of the important things to note is that because employers have the responsibility of making safety data sheets readily available to their employees and to train them on the use of hazardous chemicals, it is incumbent upon the employer to be able to develop some type of system by which they can provide an updated chemical inventory and the ability to acquire updated safety data sheets. As we know, safety data sheets are being modified over the next 2 or 3 years to meet the HAZCOM standard. What I would encourage the caller to do is to take that assessment of what the active products are in the workplace and communicate directly with the manufacturers as to whether there is a new safety data sheet for that product. It could be that over time they may have a product sitting on a shelf or in a flammable cabinet that hasn't been used in a while. However, that product may have been bought and sold by multiple manufacturers over the course of 2, 3, or 5 years. That inventory will help the employer assess whether that product is still active or it should be end of life, as well as determine who the current manufacturer is of that product in order to obtain the updated safety data sheet and ensure that you're providing this information to the employees. What we've seen in the marketplace is that aside from the OSHA HCS 2012 changes, that most employers are systematically doing a review of their safety data sheets anywhere from quarterly to annually to make sure that they have all of the safety data sheets. Because as we know, from time to time, different products may come in through alternative channels other than shipping and receiving, and we may not have caught the safety data sheet for a particular chemical in the workplace. This gives an opportunity to do that.
Well, Louisa, would you say that if a company requests, and we're getting to the deadline of the manufacturers to furnish the SDS in the new format, and if you send a request and they don't update theirs to the standard, you'd recommend that the person make sure that you've got a copy of your request on file in case you were inspected and it was looked at by OSHA and they asked why it's not in the new format?
Absolutely. Employers can deploy a number of different methods to document their due diligence, and that's one of the key things that our callers today, our audience today, should walk away with. It's important to be able to document all the steps that you're taking to show due diligence and good faith to comply with the standard. Being able to note communication with manufacturers of these products who aren't quite ready to migrate over to the new standard. Should an OSHA inspector walk in and see that you have SDSs, MSDSs that are dated prior to May 2012, they may request some type of documentation asking whether you've communicated with the manufacturer, you be in a position to do so. Again, what we're going to see over the next couple of years is that there will be an increasing number of manufacturers who will be issuing revised safety data sheets. It is incumbent upon the employer, regardless of whether you're a wholesaler, distributor, or a downstream customer, to show that due diligence that you're moving forward to ensuring that the standards are in place and you're complying with those regulations for your company.
Okay. Next question. OSHA has yet to issue compliance guidance to its inspectors, but do you have an opinion regarding very small containers? I'm aware that original compliance guidance documents did not give any relief on this issue.
Speaking from the standpoint of workplace container labels and to an extent shipping container labels, it's important to notify the reader of that shipping container or that small vial that a safety data sheet and additional information on the chemical hazards of a product are available. In the workplace, everything from placards to signage to access to the MSDSs themselves, that can be noted on that particular product, as well as with shipping containers. Again, OSHA has a brand new document that specifically discusses labeling. In terms of training, again, while that's a tough one at a very high level, we do know that there's continuing discussion as to the detailed degree of what data should appear on a product. For example, if you have vials of reagents that appear in a kit, how do you determine where is the best place to put that information? There is a great deal of collaboration between manufacturers and OSHA to ensure that that information is properly presented. So in the case of a kit MSDS or kit safety data sheet that has 4 or 5 different vials, perhaps that information would appear on a product insert that accompanies the shipping container. It will vary based on the manufacturing environment as well as the industry. So I would encourage open dialogue to see what the specific requirements are for that particular industry.
And I have another question that's related to labeling. It says, on the labels you listed GHS pictograms, but I was under the impression that a shipping container does not have to have the GHS, but should have the DOT, which would be correct? And how well is the DOT being integrated with the GHS in the U.S.?
Let me answer the second part of that question first. With regards to the DOT, as we discussed previously on the slides, the Department of Transportation oversees Section 14, which is transport information. What we've seen with the shipping labels that are produced for U.S. distribution is that GHS pictograms and DOT images can appear on the label. However, they should be of different sizes so as not to provide conflicting information. So that's a key point there. You know, there is some flexibility in terms of what can appear and the sizes, but with regards to shipping labels themselves, the DOT shipping label should contain the applicable applicable signage, the applicable image. GHS pictograms as applicable would be shown as well, but a different size.
Okay. We've got about 3 more questions we'll try to get to. One of the questions asked, what is the link for the OSHA site for revision information? Is there a specific link to a website?
Let me put the link in the final Q&A. There are a couple of
we'll have that in
the
final question. Okay.
Yeah, there are a couple of different links that will be very useful, and I'm happy to include a half a dozen or so that
we'll put that. We will have that included with the question document and answers.
Fantastic.
Do barrels of waste material such as oil need to have an SDS label?
The short answer is yes. The reason is that if you have a barrel of stuff sitting somewhere, the average person wouldn't necessarily know what's in there, and it may end up sitting next to something that it shouldn't.
And that's also a cross-reference to EPA. EPA is going to require you to have an SDS with items that are being moved and transported, so would DOT. So if you're creating a different product even out of multiple materials, you're going to have within your company SDSs. Okay, the next question. We have thousands of chemical MSDSs that are linked to our inventories in SDS Pro. Can we get assistance to change over from MSDS to SDS? And I think that'll be more of a one-on-one question for your company. Let's go on to the next question. Can we use? Yeah, go ahead. If I can just
refer back to the previous question regarding basically what you're saying are intermediates. In particular with the refining industry, as you are creating product, there are intermediates. Intermediates are products like any other. They just don't happen to be going outside and shipped to the downstream workplace. However, they're chemicals nonetheless, so safety data sheets must be authored for those products.
Right. And this will be the last question that we have time for today. All other questions we receive we will have in the document. Can we use this particular training that you went through this afternoon to train our employees, in particular the 16 criteria on the SDS sheets and the pictogram information?
Again, a good question. As I mentioned previously, as part of the disclaimer, this particular webinar isn't meant as a formal training on the safety data sheet, but certainly feel free to use it as a reference guide along with 1910.1200G that explains in further detail each of the different sections of the safety data sheet as well as employers' responsibility for training on the labels and so on.
Right. It's a good checklist and a good starting point. And also remember that over the next couple of years you're going to have to train to the old standard as well. So take the new information, incorporate it into your old training session, and because you're going to need to cross-train between both because they're coexisting.
That's correct.
And Louisa, I want to thank you and SDS Pro. I'm still having a hard time saying that instead of MSDS Pro. I've worked with you guys since 2000, and I want to thank you for doing the presentation today, and invite everybody that was on today that if you didn't sign up for tomorrow's webinar, feel free to. You'll get some of the same information, but also a manufacturer's perspective. Again, thank you for attending today's webinar. In the near future, you will receive an email directing you to a replay of the webinar and the associated documents. Also, watch your email for announcements about future webinars, and be sure to visit the ASA website at www.asa.net. Have a safe day.